The last call came the way the cold arrives in the north. Without hurry, without apology, and with the certainty of something that was always there, only now acknowledged. I was alone on the night shift at the Coastal Communications Center, a squat concrete building walled with old maps and newer monitors, air saturated with the background hum of transformers and the faint antiseptic tang of ozone from dust warmed and cooled and warmed again. The aurora was strong that night. Even without stepping outside, I could feel it in the static, in the way voices came through the HF bands with a crispness that made consonants bite and vowels stretch like breath across glass. The big clock above the patch bay ticked once, twice, and the line labeled AUX4 lit with a tired amber that looked, for a second, like the ember of a cigarette held down to the filter. I patched in, expecting a trawler's terse position report or a weather relay, and instead heard a sigh, the kind people make when they are not alone but soon will be. "Base to mainland," a woman's voice said, formal at first, but frayed as a sleeve pulled too many times through a tight space. "Polar Station Sever-13, requesting link. Is anyone there?" The call sign froze the back of my neck more effectively than the drafts that slipped under the door. Sever-13 had been decommissioned before I ever wore this headset. Shut down after an accident they never explained in detail. Only an incident report stamped with a black rectangle where the narrative should have been. We had a photograph of that station in the break room, the kind that fades to a greenish sepia with time. A row of low prefabs on a field of hammered snow. A windsock pointing not to a direction, but to the idea of direction. And the aurora kneading the sky like a hand working linen. Someone had written, in blue ballpoint on the frame, "Last winter, then sleep." I keyed the transmitter, throat dry with a taste like powdered aluminum. "Mainland copy," I said, and my voice felt rented. "Identify." A beat of blank carrier hiss. Then, "Engineer on duty, Elena Zorina," the voice said, reciting the way people do when habit holds them together. "We have a problem with the heat exchangers. The wind. The wind is carrying ice as if it were sand." There was a transient crackle, and then the distinctive warble of an HF path flexing under auroral currents, like the sound of a saw drawn lightly across the edge of a table. I pulled the old station files from the cabinet with my knee, while my hands stayed on the board. Zorina. I had seen that name once, under a transparency, in a list of team members and duty rotations. I shouldn't have remembered it, unless I had been waiting to. "Sever-13, what is your timestamp?" I asked, because there are questions that can lift or sink everything, and this one wears a neutral face. Silence like snow held in a cupped hand. 2104 hours, she said. March 2nd. A pause, as if checking a wall calendar taped askew. 1996. The clock above the patch bay ticked again with the noise of a tooth slipping. Our system stamped the call at 2:14, March 2nd, 29 years later, while a part of me began, with the reflex of a mechanic, to sort out likely faults. False IDs left in a repeater cache, pirate operators playing games, a number keyed wrong in the darkness. Another part slipped into a place that had waited under everything I did. Every night I stayed late or slept in the office. Every time I wandered to the break room photograph and traced the letters in the caption with a finger I told myself was only bored. The part that remembered a different voice on a different night. The first winter I worked here when a storm took the power across half the coast and I fell asleep at the console, cheek welded to cold plastic, and woke to a single sentence in my headphones, pitched low and intimate, more breath than sound. "If someone hears this, please hold the line." I had held it then, as I held it now. "Sever-13, Elena, I read you," I said, and the room's smell shifted. Dust, hot metal, my own wool sweater beginning to give off that wet iron scent that comes when your breath condenses on it. and then evaporates. Oh, report conditions. Is team safe? Inside for now, she said. There are only 2 of us on site. The others are down at the outpost. We kept appointment to run the long transect before the storm closed in, and then the storm did not unclose. We tried to wait. The heat exchangers behaved like polite, dying animals. They try, then they stop. We have put the last fuel to the generator. The windows sound like they are asking to be let in. The timbre of her voice was not fear. It was concentration edged with shame, which, in my experience, is the frequency where most disasters live. I gave her the procedures I had no right to give across this kind of gap. Bleeding air from lines, cycling pumps by hand, and listened to her do the things with gloved hands, describing the texture of valves, icy like mint, she said once, then laughed at herself, sound folded in wool. The smell of a room after ozone shocks its own thin halo into being, the way a floorboard, old, heavy, probably scavenged from a shipping pallet, creaked under the weight of what is not here. She paused after that phrase as if she had startled herself, and I wrote it down because something in it matched a hunger I carried and never named. We made it an hour that first night. The line faded in and out with the aurora, which that far north pulls the ionosphere up and down like a lung being practiced back to breath. At the end, she said, quieter now, as if the space around her had pressed closer. If the link drops, we will call again when the sky is green. Then she added, like a person closing a door softly so as not to wake the house, please hold the line. When she went, the room clicked into its ordinary machine cadence, and it was as if the temperature rose by a half degree. A simple return of a human body to a space, except I was alone. I printed the log before I could change my mind, found the personnel sheet I had remembered, and there it was. Engineer Elena Zorina, Sever-13, last confirmed transmission, March 2nd, 1996, time uncertain. The sheet smelled faintly of old toner and the plastic of the sleeve, the way archived things smell not only of themselves, but of the cupboards that keep them. The next night, they called at the same minute, as if the aurora were a clock and the ionosphere a certificate of attendance stamped by the green light. I patched in faster. For a while we talked across protocols and prayer, which, I learned, share more in common than either side wants to admit. I told her where the spare diodes would likely be, how to warm them in her pocket before soldering because a cold component breaks not with a noise but with a refusal to ever have existed. She told me the air in the corridor smelled like an electrical storm pressed flat and slid under the door. How the reindeer across the flats had not moved for an hour at noon, as if listening. How every hair on the back of her hands remembered the old blizzard that taught them. She said her colleague's name was Pavel, and that he had a way of being silent that made her less alone. I could hear him in the background sometimes. A cough, a chair leg acknowledging that weight had shifted. The 3-note rhythm of a Zippo being opened, struck, closed, then opened again. He did not come to the microphone. The third night I asked a question I had been circling like a dog who knows the door is locked but wants to be sure. What do you see when you look out? She was quiet so long I thought we had lost the path. Then, slowly, she said, "It is not what I see. It is what it seems to see." The light moves across the snow with that greedy softness a cat has when it owns a room, and walls do what they can to be walls. If I let the eye rest on one point too long, the snow makes a sound. Not a real sound, but the idea of one. Like old film burned a little too bright at the edge. It smells like nothing and makes your mouth water. Do you know this? I told her about coastal fog that eats texture until ships become likelihoods, and a buoy bell seems to ring from inside your own teeth. She laughed, and the laugh turned over and showed its belly full of something else. The fifth night, I broke a rule. Between calls, I drove out to the storage hangar, where we kept hardware so unfashionable it had gone from obsolete to artifact and back to indispensable when something modern failed. The hangar air had the dry cold that picks up every oil smell and shows it to you. I found an old field transmitter, the kind with a wheel you could spin to feel the band under your finger, and an antenna you could string from a nail to whatever promise you could convince a building to make. I signed it out under emergency training, a fiction so flimsy it became serious, and loaded it into my car, which smelled faintly of wet wool, coffee grounds, and the ghost of a pine air freshener that had done nothing and died nobly. The city fell away. The road narrowed until it was not a road, but an intention. The kind that depends on people keeping a promise long after they remember to whom they made it. I drove to the old coastal relay, a place no one monitored anymore because the world had moved to satellites, and we had agreed, collectively, to forget that sometimes distance shrugs off convenience and asks for strangers to plead into night. The relay had floors that creaked at certain thresholds in a way that made you step differently, not because you would fall through, but because some old pleasantness in you wanted to salute the fact of a thing that had held longer than expected. I set up the transmitter in the central room, ran the antenna to the rusted ladder on the roof, and a smell like cold rope and old paint came down with the dust. When the clock in my car read 2:12, I turned off the space heater with the switch that felt, in that second, like a sacrament. The room breathed back cold immediately, the air pinching the inside of my nose the way it does when the temperature is decisive. The transmitter warmed under my hands with a low note like a throat clearing, and the static settled around a shape. Sever-13, I said, voice threaded through the old coil. Mainland on manual relay, I have you. The reply came faster than my own breath. There you are, she said. Not surprise, but relief so complete it made my eyes feel lined with a different skin. We thought perhaps the line goes not nowhere, but somewhere we did not follow. Behind her, a door knocked once against a frame with the irregular cadence of a rope hitting a mast. The sound threw a shadow in my body. Report, I said gently, because care is sometimes a tone more than a word. She told me that Pavel had tried to go to the generator hut and had come back with ice on his eyebrows like salt on a glass rim and eyes that kept listening even after the room was quiet. She told me the radiator in the sleeping bay hissed a soft, urgent S, like a person telling a child not to wake the others. She told me the calendar had a picture of swans and that one of them had a smear across its wing where the ink had smeared, so that it looked like it had flown through its own idea. And then, as if turning her face from a window, she told me a story without announcing that it was one. When I was 8, she said, my father took me to the Museum of Communications in our town. There was a demo with 2 tin boxes and a string, and the guide said voices travel along what they are given. I was disappointed. A secret not much more than a string. But then he put the string over a metal rod and asked me to speak, and my voice did a thing I had never asked it to do. It became more me and less me. It had metal in it. He said the world is full of rods and strings we cannot see. Sometimes I think the snow is one. I told her my first winter in the center, a voice had asked me to hold the line, and I had learned that endurance is a form of devotion no one sings about. She made a soft sound, agreement or sympathy, a little scratched by the audio path. And then the band buckled, a low yawn of the ionosphere when it turns to its other side. We lost each other there. I sat in the cold room and listened to the smell of hot dust evaporate, the metallic sweetness of my own breath, as if I had been licking a coin. I had not asked the question that had curled under all the others. I did the cautious thing. On my way back to the center, I stopped by records. There is a drawer for things we do not like to open because they keep pieces of time like seeds keep seasons, and opening them feels like a theft. Sever-13's after-action file was there. Thin, too thin, the way a story is when the storyteller is protecting something. An index card tucked in the back held 3 lines of transcript not given anywhere else. I read them in the light of the hallway, the fluorescent tube buzzing with a faint 50 hertz that laid its own grid across the words. "If someone hears this," a woman had said, "please hold the line." Then, after an interval measured as long, a different voice, lower, the kind a night makes of a man who has not stopped watching the same door. "I'm here," he had said. "I promise." The last line was in the original hand, not a copy. The line went dead. The next nights I went to the relay as if to a vigil. The space heater and the transmitter were jealous of each other, and I fed the transmitter. The cold became articulate. It had regions and moods, a bite at the knuckles that felt like a request, a river of thin air by the floor where a hair would lift if you let your hand rest. Outside, night had a smell like a wet stone pocketed and warmed, and then returned to the river. Elena told me things that people tell each other when the clock they consult is not on the wall, but in their bodies. How silence has a grain if you listen long enough. How, when the sleeping bay door opens by itself, it does so with a social caution that makes you like it. How even the dead light bulbs in the ceiling change color with the aurora as if dreaming. I told her what the forecast said, though it no longer felt like a category where weather and event were different. I told her stories about the coast, the way fog is full of whispering birds that never land, the way a lighthouse can make a moth feel like a bishop. Between transmissions, I read the old file the way one reads a book you already know the ending to. On the 7th night, I asked, "Elena," I said, hands steady on the dials, as if steadiness could be seen from where she was, "what is your day count?" I heard her glance at something, then at something else. "It is the same as it has been since you first answered," she said. And now there was something in her voice like the warmth you notice after stepping in from the cold. Not because it grows, but because your body changes its mind about it. We do not move. The wind moves. This suggests certain things. "Your name is?" I had not told her. "Isaac," I said, lying on the first syllable and telling the truth on the second. Because that is how I have always approached my own life. A compromise between what I can bear and what I can serve. "Isaac," she said, "you are good company." The 8th night I brought a thermos and did not drink it. The arc of how something becomes a ritual is an easy one. You do it twice, and on the 3rd time, it recognizes you. The band was clean at 2:14, and then not clean. And then a voice came in that was not Elena's, though the room behind it was the same room. Male, a little hoarse, as if he had been speaking softly for a long time, perhaps to his own hands. "This is Pavel," he said. "Elena is resting." He said resting the way scientists say dying when they speak over a cadaver in a teaching lab and want the first-year students to learn respect before they learn words to hide behind. "We tied the inner door open and the outer door closed," he added, as if this detail mattered more than any, which it might have. "We would like to know if you can keep the link." I told him we could. I told him things I knew about keeping links between different kinds of weather. And this is when I came to understand the internal shape of the anomaly that had taken us both in. It was not a ghost in the easy sense. It was something the aurora and the architecture had made together. A loop of speech and reply that had become its own structure, like a snow cornice building itself from the repetition of wind. The station's old antenna array, Yagis strung above permafrost threaded with wiring that hums more when the temperature falls, had become, under certain conditions, a storage device. Voices went into it and came back out. Not as recordings, but as resurrections that required our participation. They needed a body to lean on. Ours would do. The logic of it was neither merciful nor cruel. It was simply the logic that happens when longing and physics find an overlapping frequency. On the 9th night, I stopped writing answers before I said them. I listened to the delay between my voice and its after voice when the band bent. I heard, buried under the noise floor, a sentence that made my fingers forget heat. My own voice, younger by a decade in the vowels, saying, "I promise." I took my hand off the heater switch without meaning to, and the cold stepped forward. The 10th night was the last. I knew it. The way you know there is one match left in a box because of the weight, and because your hand is different now than when you began. Elena's voice was calm, a calm that arrives when a person has discarded what they thought they had to carry and found, under it, a different shape that fits the hand. "Isaac," she said, and my name in her mouth changed rooms in me. "We have done what we can do. Pavel says the station is an instrument. Instruments should be played well or put down kindly. We would like to ask you something. There are requests that obligate the universe." "Say it," I said. "When the line drops," she said, "hold it." It sounded like nonsense until I heard the smile in her voice. A small naked animal turned palm up for a second. "Do you understand?" I did. The loop was hungry for closure. That was its appetite. The first winter I'd heard the sentence that made me a different person, and I had answered with the promise I would spend 10 years trying to enact without knowing its grammar. The last winter, or the first, depending from where you look, it was my job to speak that sentence into being so it could arrive for me when I needed it. It was not causality in the way we like to measure on whiteboards. It was vow in the way winter measures, by who will stay and what they will say. The heater hummed against my knee, a small, loyal thing that had warmed me more by being there than by its wattage. I turned it off. The room put its hand on my face. "Elena," I said, and the name steadied the world. "I will hold the line." We talked a little longer about trivial things that were not trivial because they were the only things left. How the air tastes when metal is very cold. How footsteps sound on a floor that has remembered too many steps. How sometimes a smell comes into a room like a visitor you almost recognize and leaves you sitting straighter, although you cannot say why. Then she said very softly, "You are kind." I wanted to say that kindness was a way to smuggle meaning past despair, but that would have been about me. So I said nothing. The band began to thin. Her last words were the words that had started everything, placed carefully in my mouth by a person I would never meet in the ordinary sense and would know better than anyone. "If someone hears this," she said, and the room creaked under a weight not present. Old dry wood adjusting to a temperature swing and a future. "Please hold the line." In the small eternity the signal took to fail, I did the thing the loop had asked of me since before I knew it existed. I leaned into the microphone and let my voice go out exactly as I had once heard it return. "I'm here," I said. "I promise." The line went dead. The room did not warm. I did. Something that had been trapped between wanting and waiting slid into place like a draw pulled home. I sat there and listened to the absence, which had a texture now, a woven thing I could run my mind along without catching. When the relay's lights blinked and steadied, the smell of after-ozone lifted and made room for the simpler scent of cold paint and my own skin. Outside, the aurora had folded back into hunger. I closed the transmitter's cover as if tucking a child, then drove in the gray, almost morning, the road a careful line between fields of hoarfrost that made every weed look encrusted with the opinion of a cathedral. At the center, the clock watched me without judgment. I took the Sever-13 file from the drawer and put it back differently, not because I had changed the record, but because it had changed me. I wrote an addendum in the margin in small handwriting, so the future would have to lean close. "Last contact received," I wrote. Message delivered both ways. Then, after waiting long enough to feel the waiting, I added, "The station is an instrument, so is the listener." In the weeks that followed, I discovered that my life had moved while I had been busy guarding its threshold. The work did not let me leave. but it no longer held me hostage. I began to sleep at home and found that my apartment had a sound I had forgotten. The radiator ticking in the night like a small animal dreaming. I called an old friend whose number I had kept meaning to delete because deletion is a way to pretend you are not afraid. I visited the Museum of Communications and pressed my ear to a tin box without the string, just to see if I could hear what I had learned to listen for. I could. Sometimes, at 2:14, I wake with the shape of a sentence in my mouth and do not speak it because it has already been spoken, and because silence has earned its turn. The world did not become merciful. Storms still came with their patient insistence. Ships still called from places no map had warned them about. The aurora still bent radio like grass, and voices still returned from their walks in time, asking to be held. But the appetite I had mistaken for duty had changed to devotion, and that changes the body that carries it. I learned to tell the difference between a link and a tether, between a promise that frees and a promise that keeps you staring at a door long after the house has moved. On certain nights, when the sky is green and the wires sing a little on their own, AUX4 lights amber. A voice will come through that is not a ghost so much as a physics problem taught by a poet. And I will answer. Sometimes it is a trawler who wants weather and ends up telling me about his son's first word. Sometimes it is a scientist whose laughter sounds like a hand found a pocket. Sometimes it is no one, which is also a kind of someone when you are practiced. I hold the line. The floorboards creak in the relay under the weight of what we are not bringing into the room, and the smell of ozone in the cold carves out a little cathedral in the air where breath echoes. I have become a keeper not of stations but of calls. I used to think that meant fixing what was broken on the far end. Now I know my job is stranger and truer. The call is a bridge. Someone has to stand at the middle and remind both shores that a bridge is only a promise remembered long enough to become wood. I am not the man who began with a headset and a photograph, and a hunger he named professionalism. That man would have tried forever to drag the past forward, and would have called that rescue. The man writing this in a narrow-handed script on an index card that smells faintly of old glue understands that some things come toward us across a medium that requires us to change to meet them. Identity is not only a thing we defend, it is a pattern we join, like two stations tuning to the same piece of sky. If someone hears this, please hold the line, not for me, for the part of yourself that knows how to listen in weather. I promise.